And this is part 2 of our week 4 lecture on American public opinion. So we've been talking in the first part about the various traditions of American public opinion. We've related those traditions to our framework for this entire course, which is the framework of elite democracy versus popular democracy. We have talked about John Dewey. We've talked about Walter Lippmann. We've talked about the fact that American political opinion, that the divides are in a sense tricky to interpret sometimes because it's not clear whether the evidence holds up a confirmation of the elite perspective or the popular democratic perspective. But the reality is that American public opinion has, in many occasions, stood up and changed the will of the elites, that it has altered their ability to do what they want. And we saw that with Nixon, we saw it with the Vietnam War, we saw it after 2003 with the Iraq War. Now let's look at the theme of equal opportunity, which is another bit of evidence to suggest that American public opinion is both shaped by elite power, but also has the potential to hold that elite power in check. And you see in the slide here an image of a girl who's holding up a card saying she is the 99%, which, as you may know, is a reference to the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was a movement in 2011 of Americans who came together and went out on the streets and camped out on the streets in large encampments all around the nation, from Wall Street to Oakland, California, to Columbus, Ohio, and on many campuses around the country as well. People camped out in order to be able to try to insert themselves into the public space of their communities and show that they had in their way of assembling an aspiration for greater democracy, because they were running those camps in a kind of a direct democratic manner. And in doing so, they hoped to model to people that we didn't have to trust the elites to do it for us all the time, that we could do things on our own. And I think many people believe and would argue to this day that the Occupy Wall Street movement, and we'll be looking at it in some more detail in another class, but the Occupy Wall Street movement clearly was a expression of American public opinion, yes? Okay, so what are the American opinions about the market and equality? Americans, we have to say it right off the bat, overwhelmingly believe in the free market system. If you work hard, so the logic goes, you should and can be able to succeed in the United States. Americans are overwhelmingly opposed to discrimination. They believe that everyone should have the opportunity to make something for themselves in the marketplace, no matter the color of their skin, their religion, or their gender. However, interestingly, while 6 out of 10 voters believe in the spirit of free enterprise and that, moreover, that it exists in America today, that is to say that the ability to engage in free enterprise exists in America today, a similar number believe that the current economic system actually works to prevent enterprise and also to perpetuate inequality, as opposed to perpetuating equality. So what does that mean? The data suggests that Americans are worried, whether they're conservatives or they're liberals. 2/3 of Americans believe that corporations today just have too much power. And that's a view that seems to be shared by the masses, even on the conservative side of the spectrum, to some extent. And I think this is important because it sort of explains this resentment that we see emerge in the last election in 2012, when when the video leaked of Mitt Romney speaking at a private luncheon where he claimed that 47% of Americans pay no income tax, which is not true. But his implication was that these people are not contributing anything to the welfare of the country. And that's patently not true. And many people say that he lost the election in 2012 because of this remark, because it made him out to appear as if he was a middle class, as if he was saying, rather, that middle class Americans make no contribution. And it was thought, actually, that this was kind of an ironic thing to say, given that he himself is a vulture capitalist. So that is, while he was lecturing often about, as a presidential candidate, going around lecturing about the importance of cutting taxes on the wealthy so they could be better job creators in his own personal profession, he was the kind of capitalist that would go around buying up old businesses and then shutting them down and selling off their assets for profit. And so, doing that activity, buying these businesses cheap and then sort of selling them down, selling their assets off for profit, can hardly be said to be job creation. So there was a certain hypocrisy in the way he was doing that. And then when people heard that he'd said this thing about the 47% of Americans making no contribution at all, I think it just seemed like it was too much. The hypocrisy was too obvious. And so it destroyed his election chances. So we have a picture emerging here then, where we have a belief in free enterprise, but a belief that corporations have too much power and that the system as it exists today perpetuates inequality. And of course, people like Mitt Romney coming in for the firing line there. That said, in 2012, only 39% of Americans said the economic system was fair. So that's more than the liberals in the country. So clearly a good number of conservatives would feel the same thing. But for all that, it's important to recognize that Americans are not generally friendly towards the welfare system, which would be, in many people's minds, the mechanism that you would use to make the system more fair. Between 43 and 50% of Americans believe that government should do more, but in the same breath, while that's a very low number, given that, obviously with the gap in wealth in the country growing quite radically, what's interestingly is that Americans may not support welfare, but they do seem to be upset about the way the new economy, as it's called, is intrinsically an insecure economy. Previous generation, 2 generations, and the generation before that, rather, Americans had long-term contracts and they had great security in their work. They would go through maybe like 3 or 4 jobs in their careers. People go through a multitude of jobs in their careers today. Contracts are very short-term. You can be fired very easily. And your hours, corporations ask us today to work in a way where our hours are very flexible. And many people say that this leads to a kind of a precarious life, that we're not really sure one day to the next if we can count on economic security coming towards us. So Americans seem to be a little bit hesitant to embrace that statistically. So we have, just as there was a kind of a mixed bag emerging in part 1 of the lecture, we can see here at the start of part 2 of the lecture also a mixed bag emerging about the way Americans relate to economic distribution and corporate power. Another interesting point that comes out of the statistics is concerning globalization. Most Americans do seem to think that globalization is positive, but many middle and low income Americans are worried about protecting their jobs from job losses to overseas manufacturing and that kind of thing. And also many Americans are worried about environmental destruction and globalization as well. So there are these concerns that we should be aware of. So on this slide, we're looking at ideologies and public opinion. Now, what is ideology? You may have heard the word ideology before. I'm pretty certain you've heard the word ideology before. Some people say ideology as if it's a bad word, okay? For example, maybe being too dogmatic or rigid in your beliefs. But this is not the original meaning of the word at all. In fact, what ideology used to refer to simply was a collection of ideas, maybe held by a group or groups as they seek to express political goals. Your book on page 103 defines an ideology as a coherent and consistent way of seeing what's valuable and worthwhile and how to achieve it. So it's kind of like a consciously held belief about how to achieve your goals in the political world as a group. And it doesn't have a negative meaning to it at all in that sense. It's simply what groups do to get their agendas framed consistently amongst each other and to project those agendas out into the public realm. Now, the first thing you need to know about ideologies is that in Europe, there are actually a wide range of them. There are diverse groups both on the left and on the right, and your textbook does a very good job of delineating what those views are. In the United States, however, when you ask people what they are politically, they will generally say, if they're going to tell you what their ideology is, they will say they're either liberal, conservative, or moderate. And that's just 3 positions. So that's interesting. Why has America only got such a narrow range of positions, whereas in Europe, you know, there aren't just liberals, there's socialists, communists, you know, and on the right you have fascists, aristocrats, you name it, right? So monarchists. This is an interesting one, right? So as we see in the slide, there are generalizations that we can make about American ideologies. We can see that liberals and conservatives do agree on a lot of things. They agree on private property rights, so there's no communist or socialist sort of momentum among the ideological perspectives here. And also, even among liberals, there's generally a strong agreement that public services should be run by private bodies to the extent possible. So the government shouldn't really be in business is the point, right? Post office maybe should be privatized. Healthcare system should definitely not be run by government. That really does contradict perspective in Europe quite dramatically, where the post office is very much run by the state, and even in a number of countries, the healthcare system is run by the state. So Americans are not at all like Europeans in that regard, ideologically speaking. But where Americans tend to differ ideologically is also interesting and worth talking about. As we see in the slide, there's generalizations that we can make here about how liberals and conservatives see the world. But we should be careful to note the complexity as well. So let's try to do that now. Liberals generally advocate government intervention in the economy. They believe that government should step in where needs be to fix things that might have broken in the economy. They believe in social justice, you know, providing welfare payments for people who are marginalized. But they do vary. Liberals vary on social issues. So not all liberals advocate gay marriage, for example, or abortion. So there's complexity among the liberals in America, despite their fairly monolithic sort of identification with the term liberalism. Conservatives, for their part, all fear unintended consequences of government intervention in the economy. We discussed this a little bit last module, where we were talking about Milton Friedman and his concern that government shouldn't interfere except in the hope of controlling anti-competitive practices like monopolies that might emerge in the marketplace. So one of the things Friedman was arguing was that if you went past that, Milton Friedman was worried that if the government regulated more than the minimum, that what could actually happen is what conservatives call unintended consequences. So, for example, you might have the very nice idea, say the conservatives, of trying to help out African Americans get into college more easily because socioeconomically they don't get into the top schools very easily. And that's not their fault. The argument goes on the liberal side, it's the fault of the system that we have. Our economic system keeps African Americans on the margins, etc., etc. Well, one way to look at that would be as an unintended consequence sort of perspective. If I do start to allow maybe more women into the workplace in a better paid manner, or if I start to encourage and solicit African Americans to go to college in a manner that I'm not proceeding with for white people, then what I might actually do is change the perception of the true cost of getting to college for African Americans, and therefore sort of encourage them to become lazy, right? Now, these conservative arguments are dated back to the time of Edmund Burke, who was the founding father of conservatism, and so it's important that we recognize that that tends to be a perspective around which all conservatives tend to agree. But that said, there are differences between conservatives as well, and we would do well to notice, for example, that you have the old sort of Eisenhower Republicans who are still around, people like Arnold Schwarzenegger, for example, the former governor of California and actor of the Terminator movies. He is fairly conservative from a fiscal perspective, fair enough, but when it comes to maybe social issues like abortion, he's an old Eisenhower Republican, right? He's not necessarily religiously motivated to have a perspective on that. He's much more interested in having conservative economic principles applied to the economy. Conversely, many libertarian Republicans would have broken ranks with the government, broke specifically with the George Bush White House in 2008, 2007, 2008, when the financial crisis was breaking out, and the TARP money was being put on the table, TARP. Many of the Republican Party broke ranks with their president, and actually Bush had to turn to the Democrats to support it, to try to rectify the economy, because it was tilting down the toilet, frankly. We'd had Lehman Brothers and Goldman Sachs and these other major corporations report that they were not able to pay their debt obligations and they needed bailouts. So this was like a little explosive charge in the bottom of the economy, right? It started hemorrhaging money. So we have a variety of perspectives then on the question of social conservatism, but also with the growth of libertarianism, we have a certain sort of hesitancy to embrace even fiscal policy vis-a-vis the financial crisis as well. So both for liberals then and conservatives, ideologically, fairly significant differences, even though their approximate positions are all roughly in and around what we tend to identify as liberal or conservative, i.e. they're not communist, they're not fascist, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Now on this slide, we are looking at tracking rather liberals and conservatives in terms of their public opinion from 1973 to 2012. And one of the clear bits of information that emerges here is that we are living in a country that is, for the greater part, conservative. The majority of Americans are conservative, are self-identifying. A little bit more than that, we have moderates who are usually non-aligned or undecided. But this is why every election cycle you hear of such a great brouhaha about getting those undecided voters, because really, obviously, they can make the difference in an election. We see that if there's good turnout, conservatives are more likely to win an election, however, right? If there's bad turnout, the liberals have a chance. But by and large, the country is conservative. Now, I alluded to this in the last slide, that it's important that we don't lump everyone in under these narrow three umbrellas. So it's important to say a little something about how these old liberal and conservative categories are breaking down a little bit today. It's important not to sort of be too homogenous in the way we think about how those categories operate. People don't think that way anymore. People, I think, are a little bit more have a pick and choose attitude. And also, I think, very importantly, if you look at the emergence of the Tea Party and of Occupy Wall Street, you see that there's a kind of a take the power back kind of mentality that's out there right now. The book describes this as populist and communitarian. That is to say that it is talking about the power of the people, and that it is sort of founding the idea of politics in a notion of the will of the people, as opposed to necessarily being, for example, like Republican or something. So, and I mean Republican in the sense of republic, not the Republican Party. So, one other thing the book observes on this point is that there is a hostility to all concentrations of economic and political power. And that's why I'm saying the antithesis is between sort of a communitarian attitude with the people are the expression of the true politics, versus a Republican mindset, which might be more top-down. So what's going on here, right? I think largely it's to do with the emergence of libertarianism. Some people would say anarchism has played a role here in this as well, but I think the libertarian track is remarkable in terms of its ascendancy. In the last 10 to 15 years since I've come to this country, I've seen libertarianism skyrocket as an ideology. Who are these libertarians? Well, they are radical individual rights advocates. They are conservative, but usually less religious, although the Tea Party has some libertarian affiliations. But they tend to say some liberal things sometimes, right? Like they oppose having a large military, and they're isolationist in terms of their foreign policy. I think libertarianism is weaved deep into the American political DNA. I think that explains why many libertarians have an appreciation for Thomas Paine and his attitudes, and also for Jefferson. But we should not, in the same breath, forget the anarchists. Anarchists are not a major player in American political life by any means, but the spirit of anarchism, in some way, shape, or form, I would argue, combined with certain elements of libertarianism, came together to create the immediate ideological context in 2011 of the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was founded on a principle, again, a kind of a communitarian principle of horizontal democratic action in an immediate geographical place, a direct democratic ethos of expressing your own democratic franchise to a group of people, as opposed to voting for someone, which would be representative democracy. Okay, so what I'm arguing here is that whether it's the Tea Party, the Libertarian wing of the Republican Party, or the Occupy Wall Streeters, that we see a certain sort of taking the power back attitude. and I don't think that fact is reflected in the data that we're looking here at this slide. So I'll try to move quickly through the next 2 or 3 slides as we're getting close to the end of the lecture here, and I don't want to go over time. Just a little bit of talk about socialization here and the origins of public opinion. What is socialization? Socialization is the overall political process by which basic political orientation is developed. And we can see a number of institutional factors that shape our political opinion as time goes by. 1, obviously, family. 2, school. 3, direct experience. And then 4, a number of factors which we've put here on the screen: class, gender, and race differences. We won't have time to talk about all of those today, unfortunately, but I'll try to come back to them a little bit in future classes in this course. But the most important thing to speak about, one of the most important things to speak about is the decline of family as an agent of socialization in American political life. 6 out of 10 adults today have the same party political leanings as their parents. So clearly, parenting, the ideology of your parents correlates with your own ideology, and it's no stretch of the imagination to try to think about why that might be so. We all have, in most families, we sit down, we have dinner together. The father will present his political views on the affairs of the day, and the children will soak those up. Or the mother might be doing it, but I think probably it's mostly the father, because fathers tend to be politically outspoken, don't they? So what's interesting, though, however, is that in America, the ideology of your parents is starting to be less and less of a predictor, and the question is why that might be so. It's not clear exactly, possibly because we're not eating dinner as much as we used to together at the same family dinner table. We're maybe watching TV more. Also, we're holding down jobs. Even young teenagers now have to, get a job for pocket money and that kind of thing. So, anyway, it's hard to say, but another vector of socialization is school. Now, it's not actually clear what kind of socialization occurs in schools, but one thing that is reported to us by those who've studied this is that schools do tend to offer a very manicured version of American political affairs to their students, especially in history courses. They get a kind of a official version of history. And so certain views are going to be reproduced there. Also, school in America is a place where class tends to be reproduced, right? So children who are not going to go to college or to certain schools are made aware of this very, very quickly, and they are marginalized within their school confines. The teachers tend not to give them as much attention or take them as seriously, etc. So that's a factor. Thirdly, talking about direct experience, the book argues that we should remember that people are not just passive vehicles of institutions. There are generational effects, as they put it. Baby boomers, Generation X, Generation Y, these different generations all come with specific kind of viewpoints. The baby boomers were the children of the greatest generation. They grew up thinking things were great, and they had a booming economy in their childhood years and into their early adulthood. Generation X and Generation Y, from the mid-1970s and the late 1990s respectively, don't seem to have had as interesting a time. And of course, we now today have millennials, and we're trying to figure out their viewpoints on things. So generations are clearly a factor, and there are generational effects that we can observe at work. Now talking about class, gender, and race, of course these things can often have an influence as well. Working class status, if you're a working class person, that tends to, as we've seen here on the blow up here in the slide, working class status tends to be only modestly predictive. If you're rich, definitely that does predict your political views. You're much more likely to be conservative. But it's not clear what happens if you are working class, which is odd given growing inequality in America. You would think the working class would be very much sort of in favor of job security, government investment, taxes, progressive taxes rather, and being able to have a union, that kind of thing. But compared to other countries, at least, the United States working class does not really act like a class, whereas the wealthy does. And I think some of that's reflected in the data here on this slide. Let's just have a look at some of the figures that are in front of us here. I've highlighted a few of them for you. As we can see here, class makes a difference, but only a modest one, perhaps not much compared to what you'd expect, especially given the way European countries reflect class. So, you know, America has the highest gap between rich and poor in the developed world. But look at some of these numbers, right? I mean, aid to the poor, working class, 54% supported, only 49% of middle class, and then 37% of upper class supported. You'd sort of expect the percentage of working class people to support that to be a little bit higher if they believed in themselves as a sort of a class personality or a class identity. Only 47% of working class people believe in aid to large cities. More middle class people believe in that than working class people. And the public education figures are not especially different for working class people. So, you know, not a lot of evidence there that the American working class is very left-wing or socialist or anything like that, which you would think they might tend to be more given the reality of the situation they live in. But clearly that's not the case. One of the topics addressed by the textbook is that we are living in very poll-driven times. We do opinion polls for everything these days, and politics is no exception, right? We poll for goods and services, certainly, to find out what the people think about the things we're trying to sell them. But also our political parties are constantly doing study groups with people to try to find out what kind of speeches will be going down well with voters, what kind of issues our voters are sensitive to at any given time. So a little history about polls then. George Gallup, one of the sort of early inventors of polling, had huge optimism for the place of polling in political life. He believed that in a large country like America, it was a way to kind of get a kind of a town hall or Athenian agora kind of vibe going on, and allow for direct participation in a manner of speaking, or at least direct representation of people's views and attitudes to the representative electorate electors. Now, polls didn't necessarily deserve the lofty reputation that George Gallup ascribed to them, however. And why is that? Well, I guess it's because polls can actually be manipulated. As we'll see in the Lee Atwater documentary, which I'm promising to show you guys this week, there are such thing as push polls. Push polls can be used to influence voters. If I call you up during election time and I say, do you believe that it was inappropriate for politician XYZ to not tell the American people that he had tried to commit suicide once? You know, and of course, is it true that XYZ has actually tried to commit suicide? Not necessarily, right? But because the person's asking the question in the poll, and of course calling up thousands of people to carry out the poll, the question starts to shape and mold the attitude of the person answering the question, because they're suddenly like, oh my goodness, I never heard about a suicide attempt. no, that's not appropriate at all. That should be public information, blah, 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 right? So, but more than that, all of a sudden they don't know who they're dealing with. The candidate maybe they were inclined to vote for, they're now thinking could be slightly mentally ill or something. So they may have to revise their opinion on that. So push polls can create problems in terms of poll reliability, but also in terms of their political utility as well. So polls are, of course, much less nuanced than an actual town hall meeting. The responders don't know each other, and they can't give feedback either. So, whereas in an actual town hall, there's chance for building familiarity, sense of sort of mutual solidarity, that kind of thing, and a real town hall has a much sort of greater sense of purpose. So, polling is a problematic, I guess, aspect of what we're talking about here today, with a concern on our parts, perhaps a legitimate one, that they can just as easily shape public opinion as reflect it, and therefore perhaps undermining the hopes of popular Democrats that public opinion can be a salutary force in our political lives. So, in conclusion, then, we should reflect on this question as asserted by Lippmann earlier on, that the public really is a bewildered herd. One of the things I think the book is persuasive on is the argument about the popular Democrats, that if you give people the information, they can make their own minds up, and oftentimes they're very wise. And I think, crucially, if you'll bear with me, I'll just put this out there. If elites have all this theoretical power to shape and mold people's viewpoints, then, wouldn't we expect to see people just following along with what elites believe the whole time? One of the things that I would like to offer you as a sort of an anecdote is a quote from Ronald Reagan in the 1960s. This is from a 10-minute recording that Reagan did, where he criticized Social Security for supplanting private savings and warned that subsidized medicine would curtail American freedoms. He said that pretty soon your son won't decide when he's in school, where he will go, or what he will do for a living. He will wait for the government to tell him. So this is Reagan, Ronald Reagan, future president, but at the time he was an actor, telling people that there was some terrible medical reforms going on in the country, and that they were anti-market and all the rest. He said, we're going to go spending our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in America when men were free. But the critical question here is that Reagan was actually contributing to a debate about Medicare, which, as you know, is for senior citizens. At the time, there was no Medicare, but it was being introduced. So, and the question we have to ask ourselves is, today, would his views not seem somewhat crazy? I mean, who today seriously would ever propose getting rid of government healthcare for seniors? Who today would ever propose that government healthcare for seniors was socialism? So if the elite Democrats insist that the public is a bewildered herd, that means their opinions are always led by the elites. But if that's true, then how come Reagan's views never stuck? Because Reagan was representing the views of a good number of elites at the time, that this was going to be kind of like an expansion of socialism in America. Today, I don't think people think that that's socialism at all. I think they think that it's just being nice to old people, to take some of our tax dollars and pool it together so that we can get efficient goods and services in the healthcare sector for older people. It seems like a nice idea for them, and I think most Americans would agree, and I know most Americans agree. The vast majority do. So I think people do make their own minds up at the end of the day. That's not to say that elite elites cannot shape opinion. We saw that in the Iraq War clearly with the opinion of the existence of WMDs, which was later proven to be completely false. But obviously, once facts come to light, then the public can and often does come to a much more deliberated view. So thank you guys. That was our lecture on public opinion, and I look forward to seeing you in class. Take care. Bye-bye.